Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to make a clay and copper necklace where the pendant is a container for a pencil and some paper. The idea for this necklace came about because I always need to be making notes and writing things down, and I have bits of paper all over the house. This necklace design means I always have a pen and some paper to hand. The same method we're going to be using to shape the clay can be used to make containers of any shape or size. It doesn't have to be for a necklace. In order to follow along, you will need these items. For the polymer clay, I used white Fimo clay. For the clay roller, I used an acrylic roller, although you could use a glass jar or something similar. And for the cardboard tube, I used the tube from a cling film or plastic wrap roll. This tube will be the mould for your container, so make sure it's the right size for that. For the glue, I used UHU all-purpose adhesive. And for the sandpaper, I used 320 and 600 grit. You can use a higher number if you want an even smoother finish. Right, so the first thing we need to do is shape the clay tube. You'll need to take your cardboard tube and add markings near one end to represent the length you want your clay tube to be. The length of the clay tube will need to be at least ½ an inch longer than what you want to keep inside the tube, which in my case is a small pencil. My clay tube was nearly 4 inches long. Then wrap a piece of plastic wrap or cling film around the tube where you'll be adding the clay. Next, condition your polymer clay by warming it in your hands, then rolling it flat or into a sausage shape, then into a ball, and repeating the reshaping until the clay becomes malleable and no longer cracks. Obviously, if you have a pasta machine for this purpose, feel free to use that. Then roll the clay out so it's at least as wide as the tube you want to create. Then wrap the clay around the cling film covered tube, making sure the markings you made on the tube are covered. You want a single even layer of clay all around the tube. Use your fingers to smooth any lumps and bumps. Then use a cutting blade to cut off excess clay where you've made the markings on the cardboard tube, and cut off the excess at the end. This will leave you with a clay tube that's been cut straight across each end. Then use a narrow straw or a skewer to add 2 holes to what will be the top of the clay tube. Make the holes about ½ an inch from the tube edges and make sure they line up. Then shape a scrap of wire into a holder for your cardboard tube, like so. This does not need to be anything fancy. The purpose of this is just to prevent the clay from touching the tile or baking tray, as that would flatten one side of the tube. Bake this clay in the oven, following the instructions on your packet. Then leave it to cool completely. And then you should have something that looks like this. Using a piece of wet and dry sandpaper and a bowl of water, you then want to sand the ends of the tube flat and smooth, and you also want to smooth the outside of the tube. Basically, you want the walls to be nice and even, with no lumps or bumps. Make sure you wear safety glasses and a breathing mask when you do this. In hindsight, I could have removed a bit more material to make it lighter, but at the time I was worried about weakening it. Then rinse and thoroughly dry the tube. Next, you need to make the ends for the tube. So condition more clay, then take a small ball of it and roll it into a flat disc. You want this to be on the thicker side, about 1/4 an inch. It needs to be at least the size of the inside of the tube. Press the tube down into this clay disc, remove it, then cut away the flattened clay. This should leave you with a disc that fits perfectly into the end of the tube. Don't touch this again before you bake it. Take another small ball of clay and again roll it into a flat disc. Press the other end of the tube lightly onto this disc and mould the edges of the disc down onto the tube. Smooth out the clay on this covered end until you're happy with how it looks. This clay is going to permanently cover over this end of the tube. If this clay sags into the tube, use the eraser end of a pencil, or like me, the stopper end of a knitting needle, to push the clay back into a flat position from the inside of the tube. Then bake these pieces in the oven. You should now have a clay tube with one end covered and a clay disc that fits perfectly into the other end of the tube. You can then sand the end of the tube if you need to, but only sand the clay disc very lightly and only if it needs it. Removing too much clay will mean the disc won't fit snugly into the tube. Now you need to make one more circle of clay, so roll out another flat disc, at least as big as the end of the tube. Place the tube on top and use a craft knife to cut away the clay around the outside edge of the tube. Basically, you just want a circle of clay that's the same size as the end of the tube. Shape a short length of wire, 16 gauge at the thinnest, into a handle shape, and make sure you angle the two ends that will be lodged into the clay. This will help to anchor the wire in the clay. Then press the ends of this handle into the centre of the clay disc and smooth the clay over the top. In hindsight, I should have made this handle larger because it was a bit awkward to use it. Then bake this clay. Once this lid has cooled down, you can lightly sand it, but remember you don't want to change the shape of it. You'll then need to glue this lid to the clay disc that fits snugly inside the tube. Before you do though, score a few lines with your craft knife on the surfaces you're going to glue, just to help with adhesion. Then apply the glue and press the pieces together. Make sure the lid is centered. Once the glue is dry, you can then test the lid to make sure it fits snugly in the tube. And it does. Note that the next steps where I'm going to paint the tube and add foil are completely optional, so feel free to skip ahead. Right, so in order to match the colour of the tube with the colour of the foil, I'm now going to paint the tube a metallic copper acrylic paint. Then once the paint is dry, I'll need to work out how big the size of the embossing foil needs to be. So take a piece of paper, a pencil and a ruler, and draw out a template. To do this, draw a rectangle that's the same length as the tube with the lid on, and the width needs to equal the circumference of the tube. To this rectangle shape, I added 1/4 inch on every side. This is the amount you'll need to fold over to stop the edge of the foil being sharp. Then cut out this shape. Then use this template to cut out the same size rectangle from your embossing foil. I could just cut mine with scissors. I place the foil on a mat to protect my work surface, and then I use my ruler to fold over the excess foil on two opposite edges. You should make these folds 1/4 inch from the edge. I folded the 2 long edges first, making sure to fold them straight and also checking that the resulting foil was the same length as the tube. If you have a bone folder or a plastic ruler, you can drag this over the folds to make them more crisp. I then folded the shorter edges, again making sure that the finished piece just wrapped around the tube. The aim is to have the copper foil edges just butt up against each other. You can use all kinds of implements to texture or emboss this foil, and I'm going to use a plastic embossing folder. If you decide to use a folder as well, make sure you use one with a large design and nothing with small details. You first need to place the piece of foil upside down on top and tape it in place. Then use your wooden embossing tool to press the copper down into the details. To do this, you'll first need to rub the tool over the entire surface of the copper to see where the details are. Do this lightly first, then go over the whole surface more completely. Try and keep the foil as flat as possible, but don't worry if it gets a bit crumpled. Try and use the bluntest end of your tool for going over large areas so as not to leave sharp lines. I used a paper stump to help softly rub the copper where needed and to remove lines. Please note that you shouldn't use a metal embossing tool for this because it will scratch the foil. My design didn't come out too clearly, unfortunately, so if I was going to make this again, I would just make a general hammered texture all over the foil. You can now wrap the copper around the tube. I would recommend making sure the join in the copper is at the back of the tube towards the top. Remember that the holes represent the top of the tube. Then use strong glue to attach the short end of the foil to the tube. This should be the end furthest from where the holes will be added. Wrap an elastic band around the tube and leave it to dry. Then unwrap the foil slightly, mark where you want the 2 holes to go, and use an awl to make the holes in the foil. Line these up with the holes in the tube as best you can. Then glue the rest of the foil to the tube. My copper ended up overlapping slightly, so don't worry if yours does too. Secure it with an elastic band and leave it to dry. And then you need to add the necklace chain. I recommend first feeding one end through the hole furthest from the open end of the tube. Then you can use your fingers to feed the end of the chain back out the hole closest to the open end. Use pliers to open the jump ring and add it to one end of the chain. Then add a jump ring and a clasp to the other end. Please note that if you want to protect the copper from discolouring, it might be a good idea to now add some kind of clear protective coating. You can now add whatever treasures you want inside the tube, and in my case that's a pencil and some paper. All I did was cut out a strip of paper, roll it up and put it inside. And that's it, the necklace is now complete. I really hope you enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.